In the heartland of America, the Miami River acts as a makeshift grave. A severed torso washes up on shore. The gruesome discovery leaves investigators with unanswered questions. In San Diego, California, a killer has left behind pieces of evidence. Detectives must sort through these small clues to prove murder. Some killers go to great lengths to leave little trace of their violence or their victims. But the twisted path that led them to murder is often paved with lies. Sometimes, those closest to us can be the most dangerous. Beneath a layer of trust can lie a hidden obsession. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. In Hamilton, Ohio, residents enjoy a peaceful suburban lifestyle. The inner-city crime of Cincinnati is miles away. But on April 13th, 1998, it didn't seem quite so far. A couple had spotted a human torso washed ashore along the Miami River and called the Butler County Sheriff's Office. Major Anthony Dwyer was the lead investigator on the case. He was also the first to closely examine the remains. Because the body had been in the river, it was badly decomposed and barely recognizable.
When we first discovered the torso, it was up here on the bank, and there was very little we could determine from that. You could tell that it was a white person, but you couldn't even tell if it was a male or a female because of the condition of the body.
The investigators were unable to tell much about the torso. But one thing was clear. This was no accident.
For the extremities being cut off, we took a close look at the bones. It looked like there were saw marks there.
The torso was carefully collected and transported to the morgue for a more thorough examination. Investigators continued to search the area for missing body parts or clues that would help them identify the body. They found nothing. Butler County Chief Coroner, Dr. Richard Burkhart, performed the autopsy. Without a head or even fingerprints to guide him, identifying the body would be difficult. And there was an additional challenge. He first needed to determine the victim's gender.
The unusual thing about the torso was that we weren't immediately able to say whether it was male or female. An examination was made of the lower abdomen or pelvis, and we found the presence of a uterus and ovaries. Obviously now the torso is a female. From there into the injuries on the arms, up in the chest.
But Dr. Burkhart still did not know how she died.
We x-rayed the body to make sure there wasn't any lead from a bullet. And examination of the heart, lungs for conditions that could have caused death, such as stab wounds, none were found.
The only certainty was that her head and limbs had been cleanly severed.
You were there.
The tool markings left on the body looked as if they were made with a household saw. Based on the temperature of the river and the level of the body's decomposition, Burkhart believed the woman had been dead for at least 2 weeks.
When we come to the neck,
At the Butler County Sheriff's Office, Major Dwyer read the autopsy report and began to slowly piece together a case. A woman was dead, but he knew little else. Each year, an average of 50 people are reported missing in Butler County alone.
Our first priority was to try and identify the body. Then the subsequent part is obviously it's a homicide or some kind of abuse of a corpse where they've cut somebody up. It's going to be a long run to even try and identify it.
If Major Dwyer hoped to ever identify the woman, he needed more information. To narrow the search, investigators turned to Dr. Elizabeth Murray, an anthropologist at the College of Mount St. Joseph in Cincinnati. One of only 50 certified forensic anthropologists in the country, she is an expert in analyzing skeletal remains. After boiling the bones to remove the flesh, Dr. Murray examined them to establish the victim's approximate age. Because the chest of the torso was slight in build, she could not rule out the possibility that the victim was a teenager. However, a closer examination of the collarbone, rib cage, and pelvis showed otherwise.
And I came up with a rough age range of probably 25 to 45 years of age at time of death, and I felt that she was probably somewhere right in the middle of that age range.
Dr. Murray next began the difficult process of determining the victim's height.
Normally you would measure a long bone such as one from the legs, but in this case we didn't have those. I had to use some unusual methods. I had to take the clavicle from the torso, measure it, and try to come up with a stature based on that. And that isn't a bone that directly contributes to your stature, so that method was a bit unusual.
Dr. Murray concluded the victim was taller than average, between 5'6" and 6'1". Although the physical description was vague, it gave Major Dwyer a definite lead.
Torso only recovered.
He resumed his search where he had started it, back at the river.
Singing in all missing reports.
Major Dwyer searched databases of missing persons reports starting 20 miles upstream.
From the Hamilton area north along the Great Miami River. The river runs to the south, so we figured the body was placed somewhere north of Hamilton.
They got a hit.
Approximate height, 5'8".
14 miles upriver, a woman from Middletown, Ohio, was missing.
Requesting all missing
She
person
fit the
reports.
physical description, both slender and taller than average.
We found several missings from north of Hamilton. We started individually pulling those reports, and we located this one missing that was Cheryl Durkin. So we started focusing on her. She fit the bill as the best possible missing person to match what we had.
At the Middletown Police Department, Major Dwyer met with Detective Frank Hensley. Detective Hensley headed up the missing persons investigation on Cheryl Durkin.
What do you think about that one?
Cheryl's sister, Carla Edwards, reported her missing on March 20th, 3 weeks before the torso was found.
The sister was really concerned at that time because she hadn't checked in with her, and it was out of character for her not to do that. Carla, her sister.
Now they needed to confirm that the torso found in the Miami River was Cheryl Durkin.
2111.
I'll give her a call and go out and talk to her and see what...
Since neither dental records nor fingerprints could be used for identification, investigators turned to DNA for confirmation. In the lab, researchers compared two DNA samples, one from Cheryl's mother and the other from the victim. They matched. Cheryl Durkin was no longer a missing person. She was now the victim of a homicide. In hopes of tracking down her killer, investigators needed to learn as much about Cheryl's life as possible. They began by retracing the last moments of her life.
And we started looking towards suspects. And you generally look to the last to see him, the first to find him, and the closest to him. Those are your key factors in most homicides.
They hoped Cheryl's sister Carla could provide them with the answers they needed. They asked her about her sister's recent activities. Carla said that although her sister had been involved in drugs in the past, she appeared to be putting her life back together.
Just really been trying to get her life clean and make a fresh start.
Cheryl had moved in with Carla. In spite of all the difficulties, the two were very close.
This is for breakfast if you want it.
She told police that just before they discovered her sister's torso, she received a phone call from a man named Scott Rothwell.
Last time we talked, he really was saying some pretty
Rothwell asked her if Cheryl's body had turned up yet. He also made comments about her being cut up in a barrel someplace.
You know everything, and if you think of anything else, give us a call, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
This information quickly made him the prime suspect. A criminal background check indicated he had been arrested several times and accused of domestic abuse by his former wife.
He lived close to the river. There were some other attributes there that started to make us look very closely at him as a potential suspect. Mr. Rothwell lives in the city of Middletown. He was a close friend of Cheryl. She'd spent some time at his house. She called him quite frequently. Come on in, have a seat.
Major Dwyer brought him to the Butler County Sheriff's Office for questioning.
Hey, Scott, I appreciate you coming down.
Rothwell explained he'd heard rumors that a local drug dealer had killed and dismembered a woman fitting his friend Cheryl Durkin's description.
Couple 3 years.
He didn't know the man's name, but he agreed to help in any way he could.
I want to show you something here. When we first targeted Scott Rothwell as a suspect, one of the first things we did is we pulled his phone records. That enabled us to track phone calls that she had made to him and isolate when she was still alive. Then any known call ended at about February 24th of '98, and that helped us narrow down a time frame as to when she probably disappeared.
The last phone call Cheryl made to Rothwell was from a payphone on Garfield Avenue. He explained that Cheryl frequently called him from that payphone. Because she didn't have a car, she relied on friends for rides. Dwyer believed his story.
Right.
He was a pretty stand-up guy. He came forward, cooperated. He helped us quite a bit with the phone records. I'll tell you what, Scott, I appreciate you coming in. I know it's been a long day. As the case unfolded, he became less and less of a potential suspect.
The investigators were convinced Scott Rothwell was not a killer. Even with more information, it amounted to nothing more than an unsubstantiated rumor. They were no closer to solving the Cheryl Durkin case than when they began. Her killer, a person capable of extraordinary cruelty, was still out there. In Ohio, a vicious killer had murdered 34-year-old Cheryl Durkin and cut her body to pieces. Her torso had washed up on the shores of the Miami River. The victim's head, as well as her arms and legs, had not been found. Desperate for leads, they tried a new approach. Cheryl's remains were sent to Dr. Stephen Sims at the University of Tennessee Regional Forensic Center. As a toolmark expert, Dr. Sims needed to determine what was used to dismember Cheryl's body. Sims examined the distinctive markings on the ends of the bones.
I can look at striations and determine something about the shape of the blade. In this case, it's a very unique cut in that the striations or the cut marks in the cut surface of the bone are not straight. In fact, they show a fixed radius curvature. I saw numerous false starts, which usually indicates a power saw due to the fact that the blade could not penetrate and so it attacks the bones at different angles. The fact that the blade is round and a very high speed, a lot of energy given to the blade, all indicate mechanically powered circular saw.
It would have been difficult to cut through bone and tissue with a circular saw. Dr. Sims believed they were dealing with a brutal killer who would do anything to hide his crime. The doctor's theory provided investigators with new insight into the person they were looking for. News of the homicide outraged the citizens of Middletown.
Okay.
The police department was flooded with tips from anonymous callers. One woman agreed to meet with investigators, but she was too scared to come into the police department.
Okay.
She'd heard rumors that a local thug named James Lawson was responsible for Cheryl Durkin's death,
I have heard rumors.
and that he had hidden her body parts in his sister's garage.
And I mean, I've seen him around.
The sister's name was Rachel Zimmer.
I mean, I've seen him
The woman
around,
knew
and I've
both
seen him
Cheryl and Lawson.
missing.
She had seen them together on more than one occasion.
Seen those two together?
Yeah.
Although the story seemed outrageous, police believed the young woman and obtained permission to search Rachel Zimmer's garage. Investigators scoured the scene, looking for clues. Although nothing was found, the search kicked the case wide open.
There was a flurry of activity that started to unfold from there. We were on the same street that Mr. Lawson lived on, and when we were there searching a garage, he started to take some actions by pulling up carpet, painting some walls. He had done several things that started to lend even more suspicion to him. Then we received another phone call from a woman stating that there were stains on this carpet that he was trying to remove. Is this the arrest location?
As investigators waited for a search warrant for the Lawson residence, they ran James Lawson's name through the National Criminal Database.
Right, that's Essential in Garfield.
The suspect had been in trouble before.
Yeah, sure.
His ex-wife had accused him of criminal trespassing.
Of 94?
Yeah, come on in. Sure.
Major Anthony Dwyer and Detective Frank Hensley served James Lawson with a search warrant.
Also, we would like for you to come
Yeah,
down.
grab my shirt.
Sure.
He agreed to go to the police department for questioning.
He's got that.
Forensic technicians from the Butler County Sheriff's Office collected carpeting from the backyard.
We've got the carpet. All right, let's get out of here.
Inside the house, investigators found bloodstains along the baseboard in a hallway. Samples of the blood were collected for analysis in the lab. In the bedroom, the chemical luminol revealed bloodstains on both the carpet and the baseboards. Samples were taken there as well. Police searched James Lawson's basement, looking for anything that might tie him to the murder. They noticed the work area was freshly painted, using an unusually heavy industrial-grade paint. But the paint wasn't enough to stop investigators from finding an important clue.
Where they used the luminol, it looked like a slaughterhouse when it lit up with the amount of blood that was sprayed by the saw and cutting her up.
Although the circular saw was never found, the amount of blood in the basement convinced investigators that James Lawson had murdered Cheryl Durkin.
I want to talk to you about a homicide we're working. There was a girl, a torso, found.
Major Anthony Dwyer interviewed the suspect at the Middletown Police Department.
I think I did read something about like.
Lawson admitted that he'd heard of the murder, but he said he didn't know Cheryl Durkin.
Like blood. Can you explain any of that to me? Why there's blood on walls over there?
Well,
He told police he was renovating his house.
hands into the.
He said he injured himself while he was cutting drywall.
Got my hands down.
The blood on the carpet was his own.
Well, yeah, I appreciate
Dwyer
your
believed Lawson was
Got a
lying,
lot of work to do over there. We'll be over there.
but
for a
without
while.
more evidence to tie Lawson directly to the crime, they would have to let him go.
We had a lot of evidence we removed from the house, as well as the painted basement. We didn't have DNA to connect the victim from being in the house, so we didn't have enough probable cause to charge him at that point.
Over the next few weeks, the blood evidence was analyzed. Samples of blood taken from the house were compared to Cheryl Durkin's DNA profile. It was a positive match. Investigators now had enough evidence to arrest her suspected killer.
Warrant here for James Lawson. Did you enter it with a pickup radius of 1 and make sure the guys in the streets are aware of it?
But they were too late. With nothing to hold him, James Lawson had already fled. A young woman had been brutally murdered. Her severed head and limbs were still missing. Ohio police were closing in on a suspect. Although they finally had enough evidence to arrest James Lawson,
Where's your finger?
he was nowhere to be found. It was a complicated case. Major Anthony Dwyer needed to find Lawson, but he also needed to find the missing body parts.
As this investigation unfolded and James was on the run, we still didn't have a cause of death. We did not have the head, the arms, or the legs. We just had the torso. That was causing us a great problem for prosecuting the case with no cause of death. Through here, so we need to know a little bit
Investigators
more about
knew
this
a murder conviction would be difficult to obtain if they did not find the rest of the body.
Find out everything you can about this phone number. And then
They
check
looked
it
at those
against
closest
these
to the
phone numbers,
suspect
see
for
if we can
clues that might lead them to the victim's body parts.
Thanks.
One of those people was Rachel Zimmer, James Lawson's sister. Major Dwyer and Detective Frank Hensley
Rachel.
had already searched her garage. Now they picked her up for questioning.
Drinking. We had to get away from all this.
We felt very strongly that she was involved in the case. We felt that she maybe even have buried some of the body parts.
Rachel finally admitted that Lawson had hidden Cheryl Durkin's body parts in a barrel in her garage. Then, when things settled down, she and her mother buried them in another part of the state. Rachel insisted that she hadn't heard from her brother since he disappeared.
You think you can find it if we head that way?
Yeah.
Knowing that she helped cover up the crime, she agreed to help them in hopes of a lighter sentence. She led police to the places where she and her mother had buried the body parts.
We parked in a very secluded area and we walked back into the woods. There was a trail. She looked back up at the roadway and could tell about how far she walked when she buried the parts.
Right here. This depressed area right here. Right in here. Yeah.
There, the investigators found a skull buried in a shallow grave.
We did some light digging and were able to uncover the top of Cheryl's face. As we brushed the dirt away, you could see the enamel on her teeth kind of lit up. And then we stopped at that point to bring in the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Murray, to do the complete excavation. Yeah, this is Lieutenant Dwyer. Yeah, go ahead and put an all page out for the detectives. We need some people up here to secure this area.
Backed by a team of anthropologists and police officers, Dr. Elizabeth Murray excavated the rest of Cheryl Durkin's body.
Because of my background in archaeology, I used modified archaeological techniques to excavate the remains. The shallow grave sites contained the head and neck, and also the right leg and both of the feet.
After processing the remains, Dr. Murray examined the skull to determine the cause of death.
There were at least 4 impact sites to the skull. There was some damage to the region of the cheek here that extended across the nose, and that could have been 1, maybe 2 different blows to the face. And there was a sharp margin here at the edge of the nose that looked like the weapon had some kind of an edge to it. Also on the side of the skull, there was an area of damage here that was blunt trauma, where a large piece of bone had been driven into the skull from a lateral aspect inward. And then a small lesion behind the ear here where something had impacted the skull from behind. So obviously the person was battered with some kind of a blunt object.
The lab tests confirmed the suspicions of the investigators. The DNA evidence obtained from the torso, the skull, and the limbs all matched. They all belonged to Cheryl Durkin. Now, police turned up the heat on one of the people who helped Lawson dispose of the body, his mother. 46-year-old Susan Abdow was arrested at her home on September 1st, 1998. Abdow admitted to her role in the cover-up, but claimed she didn't know anything about the murder until after the fact. She told investigators that she was only trying to protect her son.
Well,
According to Abdow, James had left town and had not contacted her. Once again, investigators hit a dead end. Lawson was on the run, and his trail had gone cold. Months passed. And then, Dwyer got a phone call.
Criminal profiling show contacted us and wanted to feature him as a suspect that was on the run. So they came in, they filmed it. A few weeks later, it aired.
Again, tips poured in by the hundreds. They received a phone call from an elderly woman in Indiana.
Detective section, Hensley.
She claimed her granddaughter was living
Where at?
with a man she believed to be James Lawson.
When's the last time they saw him? Okay, we'll be right there. She actually had a video with Lawson's picture on it. At that time, we went to Indiana. She showed us the videotape there, and we immediately identified a man she knew as David Wallace as James Lawson.
Not today.
She said he had been acting suspiciously since the broadcast. He was extremely uneasy about being photographed or videotaped. An arrest team from the Middletown Police Department, as well as officers from 4 other departments, surrounded Lawson's residence.
Stay forward, hands on top of your head. Hands on top of your head. What is this?
Lawson was arrested
I'm David
and charged with the first-degree murder of Cheryl Durkin.
David Wallace.
Let's lawyer first.
During interrogation, Lawson admitted nothing, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Based on the evidence, investigators believed that Cheryl had stayed the night at Lawson's house after he picked her up at the payphone. The couple argued, Lawson lost his temper, and Cheryl paid a tragic price. He then dumped her body in the Miami River, hoping it would disappear forever. On December 13, 1999, James Lawson was convicted of the murder and dismemberment of Cheryl Durkin. He was sentenced to 21 years to life for murder, evidence tampering, and gross abuse of a corpse. James Lawson believed destroying the identity of his victim would mask his guilt. But a relentless investigation and solid forensic evidence exposed his brutal crime. In Southern California, investigators faced an equally disturbing case. In order to solve the crime, they would have to delve deep into the mind of an obsessed killer. In the summer of 2000, the city of San Diego, California, was the site of a gruesome discovery. On August 14th, a young man searched a dumpster outside a pet shop. He was looking for cans to recycle. Inside a paper bag, he saw something that startled him. It looked like a charred finger. Investigators from the San Diego Police Department were called to the scene. They questioned the man who called in the report. He said he was collecting aluminum cans when he found what he thought were fingers.
Could you stay right here? We're gonna go ahead and check it out. But could you stay right here first? Sure. Okay, thanks.
Although they appeared to be human fingertips, detectives needed to be sure.
Call the forensic specialist.
They called in experts to analyze the findings. Tom Washington, a latent fingerprint expert, searched the contents of the dumpster. To avoid contamination, he isolated each piece of potential evidence on white lab paper. He knew immediately they were dealing with something highly unusual.
Well, right off the bat, we could tell they were human fingertips because they had the fingernails on them.
He found 8 fingertips in all.
This bag.
Investigators sifted through the dumpster, careful not to disturb any evidence. Along with the fingertips, they also found a number of other items, including a pair of bolt cutters. On the cutters, they noticed a bar-coded SKU number. Police believed it could lead them to the store where they were purchased.
That's good.
And perhaps the most chilling was a page of handwritten notes that outlined the crime step by step.
There were some papers that had different things written on them, kind of a to-do list. Things like rent a vehicle large enough to extract a body, time off from work, console with the victim's grieving family. Basically a schedule of things that the murderer had planned on doing.
The evidence in the dumpster pointed to a crime that had been carefully planned and then brutally executed. Whoever did this wanted to make sure the identity of the victim remained a mystery. San Diego police were facing a complex case. Sergeant Bill Holmes knew it would not be easy.
Well, initially we didn't have any leads. When you have no idea where your crime scene is or where the rest of the body is, that's a tremendous challenge.
Investigators hoped the crime lab would find more answers. Forensic expert Tom Washington examined the fingertips.
The main challenge was identifying the victim. We had the fingertips, but we didn't know who they belonged to.
But the tips were so badly charred, a readable fingerprint would not be possible. Police knew they would need more information if they ever hoped to find out where these fingertips came from and how they ended up in the dumpster. 8 human fingertips had been found inside a dumpster in San Diego. Who they belonged to and how they got there were anybody's guess. Police looked at items found in the dumpster for clues that might lead them to the killer. At the San Diego Police Crime Lab, the bolt cutters were examined by forensic specialist Sean Monpetit. Investigators suspected they had been used to cut off the missing victim's fingers.
When I looked at the bolt cutters, I noticed what appeared to be small pieces of apparent tissue on the cutting surfaces.
It was determined to be human and saved for DNA analysis. But no fingerprints were found on the item. Investigating further, police hoped the bolt cutters would yield more clues. Using the SKU number, Detective Bill Holmes set out to see who purchased them.
So I sent detectives to some stores in the area. We were able to locate where the bolt cutter was purchased, a hardware store in the area. The bolt cutters were purchased with a credit card, but because of the time of day when we got the information, we couldn't access the computer to find out who that credit card belonged to. We had the number, but we couldn't find out at that time who it belonged to.
Were there any other items that were bought by insurance?
The investigators noticed an additional charge on the credit card.
If you rented a machine, you had to get a credit card.
The same person who purchased the bolt cutters also rented a carpet cleaner.
In doing further checking, we learned that that credit card was used to pay for the rental of the rug doctor at the same store. But for the rug doctor, you had to fill out and sign a rental contract.
The name on the rental contract was Calvin Parker. Police now had a solid lead to track down. A background check revealed that Calvin Parker had no criminal history, was a veteran, and certainly did not fit the profile of a brutal killer. Detectives were beginning to think this case would go cold. They got an important break. A few miles north of San Diego, in Carlsbad, California, 2 residents discovered something unusual on their daily walk.
We were walking the water, so we ever came with the trash can, so we walked a little close to it, and it...
Although it was an ordinary trash can, the lid had been secured shut with duct tape.
Stay right back here by the car, and I'm gonna go take a look at it, okay?
The trash can emitted an unusually strong, foul odor. The officer carefully opened the trash can and discovered the body of a woman.
I need a coroner's van to 5000 Christopher Street.
At the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office, Dr. Christopher Swalwell examined the victim, a white female in her early 30s. The level of the body's decomposition put time of death somewhere between 1 and 3 days earlier. She was naked except for a scarf around her neck. Since his office had been notified of the findings in the dumpster, Dr. Swalwell knew what to look for.
The fingers were all missing. So that's when we sort of put two and two together and worked under the assumption that those two were related.
Dr. Swalwell determined the cause of death to be a large cut on the side of her neck, which severed her jugular vein.
The other significant injury she had was a laceration on the scalp, which actually had an underlying skull fracture, so that was a significant injury.
There was also evidence that the victim had been raped. Dr. Swalwell noted strange bruises around the victim's wrists, on her face, and on her back, indicating the woman had been beaten prior to her death. At the same lab, Dr. Norman Sperber, a tool mark expert, was called in to examine the strange markings on the victim's body. He believed the killer had handcuffed the victim behind her back, and that the cuffs had left the deep marks on both her wrists and on her back.
We took out some handcuffs from property down at the San Diego Police Department. I applied those handcuffs to her wrists and had her body face down on the examining table, and the handcuffs just came right to place where that horizontal mark was, just on the lower back.
The victim was restrained and subdued before she was murdered. Investigators went to look for Calvin Parker. He wasn't home, but police kept his house under surveillance.
We had some of our special investigations detectives go and sit on that residence to see if Calvin showed up.
Female, 20 to 30, red hair.
Although the investigators were making progress, the victim still remained nameless. Investigators searched missing persons reports going back several days, hoping to put a name on the body. They didn't find any remotely matching the victim's description anywhere in San Diego County or surrounding areas. As news of the grisly homicide hit the streets, people came forward with information. One witness lived in an apartment facing the dumpster. She had seen something unusual the night before the fingers were discovered.
She said that she saw a rental truck back up to the dumpster. A black male exit the truck and throw a couple bags into the dumpster and then leave.
The witness also remembered seeing the man throw something into the bushes.
Her initial impression was that it was a cigarette, but she didn't see any ashes or sparks coming from it.
Investigators returned to the scene and searched the area. They found the tip of the victim's right thumb. The tip was taken to the San Diego Police Crime Lab. Tom Washington performed the examination. The print had enough ridge detail to capture a clear print. But after running it through the database and coming up empty, they still had no one to compare it to. Sergeant Holmes focused detectives on their newest lead, the rental truck spotted by the witness.
With that information, sent a detective to check the rental agency that handles that brand of truck. Agencies, there's several in the San Diego area, and the detective eventually found an agency in the Mission Valley area.
The name on the rental contract was one they had heard before, Calvin Parker. Investigators confiscated the truck and took it to the impound lot. The chemical luminol revealed a circular bloodstain. Someone had been bleeding inside the truck, and police believed it was their victim. After a frustrating start, with nothing to go on but discarded fingertips, San Diego police now had enough evidence to arrest a suspect in the murder of a young woman. Although they now had a readable fingerprint, she was yet to be identified. Investigators had found a ring of blood in a vehicle rented by Calvin Parker, a man whose name came up early in the investigation. At the San Diego Police Crime Lab, Sean Montpetit compared the tissue on the bolt cutters to the victim's DNA.
DNA analysis of the tissue revealed that it was in fact tissue from the victim.
He then compared the findings with the blood in the truck. Both the blood and the flesh on the bolt cutters matched the victim's DNA. Police now had the direct evidence they needed to obtain a search warrant for Calvin Parker's apartment. Detective Bill Holmes led the team.
We had enough information to believe that Calvin was responsible for this crime and that it probably happened, probably occurred where he lived. So we obtained a search warrant to search that residence and search his person.
Police cautiously entered the suspect's residence. There was no sign of him, but as they began searching, investigators found clues that made everything fall into place.
When we entered the apartment, we weren't sure who our victim was. We didn't know a name. We were sure that the Carlsbad body belonged to our fingers, but we had no idea who she was until we entered Calvin's apartment. And then we found her pictures and found her identification card.
Her name was Misty Gear, and she was Calvin Parker's roommate. Investigators would spend the next week working 18-hour shifts to recover over 100 pieces of evidence.
Well, we found a variety of notes and documents. In the kitchen, we found some credit card applications using Misty's name. We found some of her checks that had been filled out and made out to Calvin. We found some notes, both at the dumpster and at the apartment, sexual in nature, pointing directly at Misty, that were written by Calvin.
The evidence against Calvin Parker was quickly mounting. Forensic examiners sprayed luminol throughout the apartment to detect any blood. Although the carpet had been recently cleaned, massive bloodstains led from Misty's bedroom into the bathroom. At the San Diego Police Department, Tom Washington compared the victim's right thumbprint obtained from the thumb found in the bushes to the thumbprint on Misty's identification card. The two prints matched. The victim was positively identified as Misty Gear. Investigators hoped those who knew Misty best would lead them straight to Parker.
We have some questions about Misty Greer. She worked here.
They asked her co-workers about the suspect's relationship to Misty.
He and Misty had been roommates for about 3 months, each having their own bedroom and bathroom, strictly platonic, although he did have desires for her. She wanted nothing to do with him in that way.
Police now had a motive. Calvin Parker was obsessed with his roommate. But they still needed to find the missing suspect. The apartment was still under 24-hour surveillance. On the morning of August 15th, Calvin Parker stopped by his apartment to pick up his mail.
There it is. Hey, Calvin. You know why we're here? Yeah. Put your hands behind your head. Stay there. Put your hands behind your head.
He was arrested and taken in for questioning.
We found the girl's fingers in the dumpster.
In the interrogation room, police confronted Calvin Parker with the overwhelming evidence they had compiled against him.
So please tell me what happened.
Parker told Sergeant Holmes his version of events that led to Misty's death.
Calvin said that he was home watching TV in his bedroom when Misty returned from work about 10:30 or so that evening. She went into her bedroom, was watching TV. About half an hour later, he went into her bedroom, sat on her bed, they watched TV for a little bit, and then they had consensual sex.
According to Parker, Misty agreed to be his girlfriend, then changed her mind. They argued, and she insulted him. He said he couldn't take it and just snapped.
He lost his temper, picked up a picture frame that was next to the bed, and struck her 3 times, once in the head, in the throat, and in the chest. She started bleeding profusely.
The extent of her injuries and the handcuff marks on Misty's wrists told a different story.
We did find picture frames next to the bed, none of which were damaged, none of which were strong enough or heavy enough to do the damage we saw in Misty's body.
Investigators believe Calvin Parker was attracted to Misty. When she didn't return his affection, he grew dangerously obsessed and attacked her while she slept. He then dragged her body into the bathroom, where he cut off her fingertips to destroy her identity. On July 17, 2002, Calvin Parker was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Murderers will go to extreme lengths to avoid prosecution, destroying all traces of the crime and their victims. But even the most careful killers cannot anticipate the precision in which forensic science will unearth even the most hidden obsessions.
Okay.
A Missouri man is shot in the head on a deserted country road. Is it murder? The only clue, a shredded bullet. Identifying the gun that fired it will be nearly impossible. In Florida, a man is beaten to death in his home. Police uncover fingerprints and rumors of an exotic weapon.
That's what it looks like.
For law enforcement, the toughest opponent is often an assassin with no clear ties to the victim. Using science as their most powerful weapon, investigators must find these hired killers and make them pay. the true price of murder. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Hillsboro, Missouri is a small town located a few miles west of the Mississippi River. On November 21st, 2000, on a stretch of commercial property owned by a chemical manufacturing plant just outside Hillsboro, a security guard spotted a vehicle sitting in a field. He discovered a man in the driver's seat, slumped over the steering wheel. The man was unresponsive. He was bleeding from a wound in the back of his head. The security guard called 911.
Jefferson County 911, what is your emergency? A man in a field...
A dispatcher alerted units from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department.
7214, 6017.
Within minutes, paramedics and deputies were on the scene. But for the man who lay motionless in the driver's seat, it was too late. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area and called in crime scene investigators. Detective William McDaniel took charge of the case.
When I pulled up, there was a car partially off a gravel roadway, had a white male slumped at the wheel. The rear passenger side window was shattered. It looked like from a bullet. The security guard found him.
Okay, I guess what we'll do then.
The evidence suggested to Detective Michael Gray the car was moving when the man was shot.
Do it here.
When the vehicle was found, it was in gear. His foot was still on the brake pedal. We surmised that the vehicle was traveling at idle speed. We initially were looking at the possibility of it being hunting related simply because of the time of year. The area in question is known for a lot of hunting.
Detectives examined the car inside and out in search of any clues. Some 30 feet away on the dirt road, investigators found shards of glass. They believe the bullet struck the car and driver here, after which he drove straight off the road. The driver was removed from the vehicle and identified by his license. His name was Larry Holman, a 44-year-old from nearby Hillsboro. The victim's wife was contacted. Detective McDaniel knew the victim from around town. He was a church-going family man, not a man prone to have many enemies.
Open up the right door.
He was also an avid hunter.
Yeah, I pulled from down the road.
The security guard revealed that the subject was in the field area scouting for deer for possible hunting locations. It's the last day of deer season, and there had been reports of poachers on the property. The car is in a field where the deer cross, so there's a chance that somebody may have thought it was a deer moving across the field.
Detectives turned to forensics to find the source of the deadly shot.
Well, the important thing was to try to determine the direction the projectile came from. Once we got a direction, we'd have a line on where to search for any items of forensic evidence, any shell casings, items left behind. That's why it was important to try to position everything back in its original location. We repositioned the vehicle back on the road. We figured out a trajectory angle based upon the approximate head height of the gentleman. It was a matter of setting up a tripod, taking a trajectory string, and then just extrapolating back into the wooded area.
Holman had been shot from behind, the bullet passing through the window and the car's headrest before killing him.
Okay, that's good.
Police used this information to reconstruct the bullet's path.
We ran the trajectory angle back from the vehicle at about 40 to 50 feet away near the wood line. The trajectory string was at about shoulder height, which would be consistent with an individual taking aim or firing with a weapon.
I like that. What do you think?
Be right real close.
Investigators scoured the woods in that area, looking for potential evidence left by a careless hunter. But police came up empty-handed. No shell casings, cigarette butts, or any clues to help explain what happened. A sheriff's deputy interviewed the security guard at the entrance to the property. He was the last person to see Larry Holman alive. Police hoped the guard might recall some small clue to help them find the killer.
Okay.
The guard had known the victim. Larry had worked there and hunted on the property often. On the day of his death, Larry Holman arrived alone and in good spirits. It was his day off work, and he told the guard he would be out in the field scouting for deer. According to a sign-in sheet,
Yes, sir, it is.
Holman had entered the property at 4:20 in the afternoon.
Holman there. Yes, sir.
He would never sign out.
Correct. Mrs. Holman?
Yes.
Police spoke with the victim's wife, Tammy, to see if she could shed any additional light on the investigation.
I need to speak to you about your husband.
I don't understand.
She said she had last seen him the morning he was killed. The couple had been married nearly 15 years. She described her marriage as happy and could think of no one who wished Larry harm. She wasn't able to provide any additional information. An autopsy was performed, though it offered few clues that could point to a perpetrator. According to the coroner's report, Larry Holman died instantly. A high-velocity slug was retrieved from his skull, but it was unidentifiable. The bullet's lead core was gone. Only a mangled copper jacket survived.
Okay.
Investigators hope to recover more pieces of the bullet in the victim's car.
See if we can preserve that. The projectile, it had fragmented when it penetrated the glass. When we processed the vehicle, we found some fragments from the projectile embedded in the headrest of the driver's seat. So we decided to retrieve that in the attempt to try to determine the caliber of the weapon and maybe the ammunition that was used.
At the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, forensics expert Todd Garrison was charged with putting the bullet back together again.
First, it hit a window of an automobile. Secondary impact was the headrest of the automobile. The third impact was the victim's head. Each one of those impacts contributing a little bit more to its damage and distortion.
Garrison analyzed the size and weight of the pieces.
One of the copper fragments out of the headrest had rifling engraving on it that was similar to the rifling engraving that was observed on the bullet out of the victim's head.
He determined that he was looking at pieces of a .243 caliber bullet.
Generally, the .243 Winchester caliber is associated with a hunting type rifle, as for deer, large game.
At the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, detectives formed a task force. If this was a hunting accident, it would be nearly impossible to solve.
Guys, watch.
Thousands of hunters passed through the area.
Space 30, 40 feet.
Detective Gray laid out what little they did know.
Okay, so you're saying about
You have an individual who's what we term low risk. The guy's a family man. The guy had no known enemies. Did not live a lifestyle that would be conducive to violence.
Investigators, however, were not yet willing to declare the case an
I
accident.
think I'm going to take the 4 names I got. The wood line,
Something didn't seem right.
glass, which we are.
Accidental shots usually end up somewhere else on the body. Headshots are usually an aimed shot. When you start thinking about the laws of probability, we have a moving target, small rear window, the thickness of the woods. It did not look like an accident.
I think we need to go out and maybe talk to some residents.
Police officially labeled the death suspicious, but they had no leads to point them to the killer.
Go back out to the woods.
It seemed the investigators had come to the end of their trail of evidence. Weeks turned into months, and no new clues surfaced. Police issued press releases throughout the small community, asking the public for help. By January, little headway had been made on the case. Then, police got a break from an unlikely source.
Hi, Detective. Okay.
Tammy Holman, the victim's widow, told investigators about a series of unsettling letters she had been receiving.
Yes, I did. It's weird.
After her husband was shot, a man named Carter Davis began writing her love letters.
You know, it's just kind of fishy.
Tammy said she had rebuffed him, but he would not leave her alone. She turned his letters over to police. "I love you and won't let you go," read one. "We're soulmates," read another. The detective's interview with Holman's widow left them with some questions.
Wouldn't say who he was.
No, he wouldn't say who he was.
They knew that a man named Alan Tripp had moved in with her shortly after her husband was killed.
Mrs. Holman started to look suspicious to us. Her actions didn't really correspond with a grieving widow. It began to expand our investigation.
Detectives ran Tammy's name through the system. Her record was clean. But they also knew her name did appear on another significant document. Larry Holman's insurance policy offered a payout of $125,000. He had an additional policy of $2 million if he died in a hunting accident. The beneficiary was his wife. For detectives, what started as a simple accident was now looking like it might be cold-blooded murder. In November 2000, Missouri deer hunter Larry Holman was found dead in a field. He'd been shot in the head with a .243 caliber bullet fired from a hunting rifle. At first, it appeared as if it was an accident, but police were beginning to have their doubts. They weren't the only ones. In January 2001, the victim's brother, Randy Holman, turned in a .243 Winchester bolt-action rifle. He knew the police were looking for that type of weapon and suspected Larry's death was no accident. Randy feared the killer was someone his brother knew who may have used this gun to murder him.
If you want to have a seat right there.
Jefferson County Detective William McDaniel.
We interviewed Randy Holman, brother of Larry Holman. He actually brought in a deer rifle of Larry's, and he wanted us to do a comparison of the deer rifle to the ballistic round, what was found at the crime scene.
At the time of the murder, the gun had been stored at the home of Larry and Tammy Holman. Randy had good reason to suspect his brother was murdered. He told police his brother Larry had been shot at before.
We were at my parents' place.
Days before his death, Larry had gone hunting deep in the Missouri woods.
Randy stated that he and Larry had a conversation later in the night after hunting. Larry stated that he had a close call. And Randy asked, "Well, what do you mean by a close call?" And he goes, "Well, I had a bullet whiz by my head." Because there was so much gun activity up in the northern part of Missouri during deer season. And they kind of joked about it.
But now, he knew it was no joke, and wondered if Larry had been shot with his own gun.
Heavily hunted. think much about it.
He just wished that that gun would be ruled out so that way he knew the gun had no involvement into his brother's death.
Alan, thanks for coming by.
Investigators sent the gun to ballistics and began interviewing suspects. First on their list was Alan Tripp, the widow's new love interest.
You know what we want to talk to you about?
Tripp had grown up with Tammy Holman and came to her side shortly after Larry's death.
Oh, I've known her since grade school. We went to grade school.
Within the last couple months, Alan Tripp had moved in with Mrs. Holman and actually gave her an engagement ring.
No.
His actions raised some red flags with us. He stated he had no knowledge of the incident, that he had spoke to Mrs. Holman several times about the so-called accident, and she stated that there was nothing there.
Calling her all the time.
Investigators also sought out a local man named Carter Davis.
Yeah, he's right over there clearing that table.
Tammy said Davis had become infatuated with her, showering her with flowers and love letters.
I need to ask you some questions about...
Letters that concerned Tammy Holman.
Oh, okay.
Like Tripp, he insisted he had nothing to do with the crime.
Tammy and I are friends.
At one time, Carter Davis actually put a note on Alan Tripp's car which said, "Did you kill him?"
She's always said
and he just believed that Alan Tripp had something to do with his death.
But other than that, she's never said much.
Police had also gotten a very interesting lead. They learned that Tripp and Davis were not the only men close to Tammy Holman.
We received an anonymous phone call. It was a male subject.
The caller suggested they check out the alibi of a third man.
It was a male caller?
The tipster said Charles Miller had a gun similar to the one police were looking for. McDaniel checked Miller's record for any previous arrests. Miller had a record. He had been arrested for check fraud. A few days later, on January 9th, 2001, investigators caught another break.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat.
Nice to meet you.
A woman gave police new information on the case.
Some information I don't know if you can use.
She told Detective McDaniel that she lived near the field where Holman was shot. For several days leading up to the crime, she observed a suspicious-looking man with a gun walking near the crime scene. McDaniel showed the woman a lineup. She identified Charles Miller without hesitation.
Yeah, right there, I'm sure.
Within hours, they had their man in sight.
Miller!
Charles Miller was arrested and brought in for questioning. He admitted he was a friend of the Holmans, but claimed to know nothing of the crime.
He's good.
They had attended Sunday schools together. Miller would come over and do work around the Holman's house. He would bring eggs, he would bring, bacon, and so Tammy would cook breakfast in the morning for him and Larry.
Miller offered to cooperate with investigators.
Mr. Miller gave us permission to do a consent to search on firearms that he had owned. We were only looking for high-powered rifles, and he actually gave us 3 rifles, one being a Browning Bolt A-Action 243.
Deputies also seized boxes of .243 caliber ammunition and cell phone records, which indicated that Miller had called the Holman residence on the day of the crime.
Once the gun was seized from Charlie Miller during the consent to search, it was delivered to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab in Jeff City for a ballistic match.
Criminalist Todd Garrison examined Miller's rifle, as well as Larry Holman's gun brought in by his brother Randy.
I test fired both of the rifles in question. From those I obtained bullets, which I could do microscopic comparisons between I eliminated the .243 Winchester caliber Savage rifle.
The rifle taken from the victim's home was not involved. That left Charles Miller's gun. There were key similarities, but damage to the bullet recovered from the body prevented a 100% match.
I did observe the rifling engraving and also isolated agreements of some individual characteristics. Not enough to say, yes, this firearm did fire this bullet, but enough that it was consistent with that particular firearm.
The forensics seemed to point squarely at Charles Miller. He was now their prime suspect. Miller, already in custody, was interrogated by Detective McDaniel.
Is there something that we need to talk He was not a very emotional person. He asked us questions if this was about his gun. We explained to him, yes, it was about his gun we seized. And he bowed his head and he looked back up and he said, I killed him.
I killed him.
It took us all for a shock. And we find out later, Mr. Miller was a very church-going person, and I believe this was eating him up inside.
You know what kind of
Police now had a confession, but what Miller was about to tell them would blow the case wide open.
Who owns a .243?
In Jefferson County, Missouri, an accident investigation had uncovered a homicide. Police had a suspect in custody, Charles Miller.
Charlie, you know why we're here?
And when presented with the forensic evidence, he confessed. But the confession was only the beginning.
Charles Miller got, I guess, infatuated with Mrs. Holman. He stated to us that he always thought she was a very well-kept woman. He and Mrs. Holman began a relationship without Mr. Holman's knowledge.
Miller told police he and Tammy were close, and her husband was becoming concerned.
I thought Tammy knew that you killed
He went on to say Tammy asked him to kill Larry.
Tammy's the one.
She wanted it done during hunting season to make it appear as if it was an accident. Miller believed that with Larry dead, he and Tammy would be free to live the life he dreamed of. Miller had tried once and missed. November 21st was his last chance, the final day of hunting season.
Mr. Miller got down to the property about 2 o'clock and actually watched Mr. Holman drive into the field. Miller was up the road a ways and positioned against a tree. And as Mr. Holman started to leave the property, he took the shot. And he watched Mr. Holman slump, his head go forward and rest on the steering wheel, and the car veered off.
Police believe he then packed up his rifle, picked up his shell casings, and left the scene. It was then that he made the call to Tammy Holman.
He told her to set one less place at the dinner table.
On January 10, 2001, detectives arrested Tammy Holman for the murder of her husband.
Tammy?
Charlie Miller was basically double-crossed by Mrs. Holman. He thought he was going to get to live the life that Larry Holman lived, and instead she pulls Alan Tripp in, who is now taking over Larry's position in the family. She was a black widow, and she had all these lovers out there, and she kind of used them all to do her dirty work for her.
Charles Miller pled guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 25-year prison sentence. Tammy Holman was sentenced to 7 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. A sniper's bullet will often give him away, but a hitman who uses a more obscure weapon poses an added challenge for police. November 7th, 1995, 8:31 p.m. A 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from a woman in Green Cove Springs, Florida.
We'll get somebody out there, okay?
The caller, Linda Jones, reported that 3 men had broken in and ransacked her home. Jones said that she had been tied up, her husband severely beaten. Deputies from the Clay County Sheriff's Department rushed to the address. On the lookout for 3 intruders, they approached the home with caution.
I'm so glad you guys are here. I don't think I know what your husband.
I just need for you to wait for me. Tell me what's going on.
A deputy secured the living room. The assailants appeared to have fled. Linda's husband, Jack Jones, lay on the floor in a puddle of blood, his hands and feet bound with duct tape. He was not breathing. The deputy began CPR. Distraught and inconsolable, his wife could offer few lucid details. Paramedics rushed onto the scene. As deputies tried to gain a description of the attackers, they did not have much to go on. Linda said the men wore ski masks. The rest was a blur. Lieutenant Tom Waugh was assigned the case.
We were told that 3 masked assailants entered the residence. They had some kind of a club or bat with them, and they had tied her up, tied up her husband, and literally beat him with this weapon. And then they went through the residence and stole various items, such as money and jewelry.
Paramedics examined Linda Jones. Her injuries seemed minor. She complained of tingling and pain in her left arm and was taken to a local hospital for treatment. Her husband was not as fortunate. Jack Jones was dead.
The crime scene itself was very violent. We noticed right off the bat a lot of blood. There was blood on the floor, because there was blood spatter on the wall, and it appears that he was drugged into an adjacent room. And on the wall, as he rounded the corner, it looked as if he had his hands on the door corner trying to hold himself back. And then once he was in the other room, that is where he was literally beaten to death.
Pieces of duct tape were scattered throughout the house, along with a partially used roll. Officials believed it had likely been used on the wife. She too had been tied up, she told deputies, but tore herself free before calling police. The reason for the break-in appeared less clear the more detectives looked around. Valuables were found in plain view.
It was made to look like it was ransacked, you know, just disheveled.
Jewelry, an expensive watch, a man's wallet with cash and credit cards were all left behind.
Those are the things that you can turn the fastest. They would have been gone. And why would you leave money? Why would you leave jewelry? Didn't seem right.
At the hospital, deputies took a statement from Linda Jones
Jack and I were sitting in the living room.
and fingerprints to help eliminate those found at the house.
Break short, huh?
She claimed her wrists were tied and her mouth sealed shut with duct tape. But something about her story didn't sit right with detectives.
They threw me against the fire.
You would have some signs of that. There wasn't any redness on her mouth or her face. That didn't seem quite right, because normally duct tape will leave a residue, or they'll leave a redness when you snatch that thing off.
Police were left with many questions an autopsy provided few answers. The coroner's report revealed broken ribs, skull fractures, and severe contusions from the knees to the top of his head. Lieutenant Jim Redmond recalls the official findings.
The injuries to Jack Jones were as a result of blunt force trauma. The injuries were indicative of a bat or some type of club.
The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves throughout the community. Detectives were baffled.
The Joneses lived in a nice neighborhood in the Lake Asbury area of Clay County. Why did somebody pick out this house? In this affluent neighborhood, quiet, peaceful, very peaceful, quiet neighborhood. Why did they just pick this house out at random to come in and commit this crime? It just wasn't right. Come on, Linda.
Investigators hoped Jones's widow might shed some light on the case. Her response, however, surprised them.
Linda felt a need to have an attorney right away and indicated that we couldn't contact her.
Her behavior, though legal, seemed odd.
Why would she get an attorney? You know, why would a victim whose husband was murdered, why would she need an attorney?
Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. They hoped someone might have seen something that would pinpoint the killer.
We learned of Jack and Linda's relationship from various people, and it was a stormy relationship. Supposedly, they just weren't happy.
According to neighbors, Jack Jones was having an affair, and Linda had discovered it. One neighbor noticed a suspicious vehicle parked outside the Joneses' residence at the time of the murder.
It was a maroon van, and it had dark tinted windows. And it left the scene, high rate of speed, no lights on.
In nearby Jacksonville, police tracked down Samantha Thomas, the girlfriend of Jack Jones. The two had been romantically involved for several months. The young woman claimed that Jack was planning to divorce his wife. But Linda had threatened suicide. The girlfriend also told police of another incident, 1 week before the murder. On October 31st, outside her home, Thomas's car was vandalized, the tires slashed. It could have been just a Halloween prank. But according to his girlfriend, Jack Jones felt differently.
Jack felt like Linda was behind it just due to all the ruckus she was raising about Samantha and his relationship.
The story seemed a bit odd, but Waugh's next find only increased his suspicions. According to their insurance policy, Linda Jones would receive $500,000 in the event of her husband's death. It was a compelling motive, but to prove murder, investigators would have to turn to the evidence. Though Linda Jones maintained her silence, the duct tape spoke volumes. Dawn Walters, a crime analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, examined scraps of tape collected by police at the crime scene. Minute details grabbed her attention.
Some of the duct tape that was submitted was pulled apart or torn apart, and some of the duct tape that was submitted appeared to have been cut.
Duct tape found on the victim was stretched and frayed, signs that the man had struggled to break free. Tape wrapped around the wrists of his wife, however, bore a tiny triangular pattern.
The duct tape was determined to have been cut by what appeared to be pinking shears or another similar cutting instrument.
Walters also looked for fingerprints, but none were visible. At least, not to the naked eye.
I decided to use the cyanoacrylate ester fuming process, otherwise known as the superglue process. The superglue fuming process is done by adding superglue drops to sodium hydroxide soaked cotton, which then begins to fume, and these fumes will adhere to the latent print residue that's present on an item. Then I used white fingerprint powder to further enhance the prints.
Within seconds, an image came into view. Linda Jones had not torn the duct tape from her wrists. And now police had not one, but 2 fingerprints to prove it. Someone had cut her free on the night of the murder. In 1995, Florida police were on the hunt for 3 masked intruders who bludgeoned a man in his home. After weeks of investigation, Lieutenant Tom Waugh had just 2 significant clues. A pair of fingerprints left at the scene, and a mysterious maroon van. The van remained unidentified. The fingerprints matched no one on file. According to information gathered by police, the victim was a used car salesman with no known enemies and a marriage on the rocks. Waugh suspected the victim's wife was involved, but she could not have acted alone.
Not too far into this investigation after the death of Jack Jones, I had felt like that this was going to be a murder for hire.
Police then got a tip that confirmed their suspicions.
There was a diamond ring.
An anonymous source accused a local man of being involved in the crime. He was a landscaper named Donald Bradley. Police took a closer look at him.
We determined that Donald Bradley owned a maroon van with dark tinted windows.
The description of the van matched the one police were looking for. A review of his landscaping business finances led to the accounting office in Jacksonville, where Linda Jones worked.
Linda Jones did Donald Bradley's taxes and did work for him. She knew him, and boom, right away, he was coming into focus in this case. One of the things I do routinely when somebody is identified as a suspect, I would start finding out who are they calling.
In Donald Bradley's case, it was not only who, but when.
This is the night of the murder. I got Donald Bradley's cell phone.
Cell phone records indicated he'd made 3 calls to the Jones house on November 7th, all around the time the crime occurred. On January 22nd, 1996, Lieutenants Tom Waugh and Jim Redmond interviewed their suspect at his home in Orange Park, Florida.
Sheriff's office, Lieutenant Jim Redmond.
Bradley admitted he knew the Joneses, but said he had no knowledge of the crime. He told police he'd been out driving for part of the evening in question.
What was the last 4?
When we talked with him that day, he was very arrogant.
Detectives soon revealed their hand.
Okay, well, we got a 911 call. When we started telling him about the phone calls to the house, he said, yes, it was concerning taxes. And then he was very, very nervous, and you could tell he kind of didn't know where to go but hold his composure. I would ask him, Donald, how could Linda be talking about taxes with you on the telephone? Well, she's duct taped, and her husband's being beat to death, and some guy's sitting on her in the living room of their house. I mean, how could this happen? And he couldn't answer that.
For Lieutenant Redmond, Donald Bradley's story was unbelievable.
We felt pretty confident at that point that he was somehow involved with the murder of Jack Jones.
All the detectives had was a hunch. To make an arrest, they needed evidence. They got a search warrant to seize Bradley's van. blood, hair, carpet fibers, investigators searched for anything that might link Donald Bradley to the killing of Jack Jones. But the van was spotless. It had been scrubbed clean. Detectives caught a break several weeks later when Bradley was arrested on an unrelated charge. They interrogated the suspect, who changed his story slightly. He admitted Linda Jones had approached him to kill her husband, but he claimed he had refused.
Bradley made up a story about Linda having murdered Jack Jones and used this African war club to do it with.
His story seemed implausible. But with his fingerprints now in the system, they could finally compare his prints to those found on the duct tape. For investigators, it was one step forward, 2 steps back. Bradley's prints did not match, which meant at least one more accomplice was still on the loose. In 1995, Florida officials believed that Linda Jones had hired a local landscaper named Donald Bradley to kill her husband. But an unidentified fingerprint indicated that at least one other man had taken part in the crime. In September 1996, Jeremy Harrison, a longtime employee of Bradley's landscaping business, had been picked up on an unrelated charge. Police wanted to talk with him about the Jones murder. Prosecutor Timothy Collins.
Mrs. Jones' initial report at the time of the homicide was that 3 individuals were involved. I think what you generally find in these kind of cases is that in every lie there's a thread of truth. So in looking at the crime scene, it was pretty clear that more than one person was involved.
Man, a long time. That's all I tell you.
It was then a matter of trying to determine who and how many other people were with him.
All right, 15 years.
Would you stand up for me?
So the critical decision then was to find that fingerprint, who it belonged to.
Fingerprint specialist Dawn Walters received Harrison's ink print to compare with evidence on file.
To compare latent prints, I look for the individual characteristics that are present in the latent print and the inked print. Characteristics such as dots and ending ridges and bifurcations. I was able to identify the 2 latent fingerprints on the tape.
The prints belonged to Jeremy Harrison. Finally, they had their proof. They presented what they had found to Harrison. He started to talk.
He had no problems in telling us that he was involved in the murder and that Bradley was involved in the murder. But there was a third person, and he wouldn't discuss who that third person was, and he was holding back for a reason.
Harrison wouldn't point his finger at the third suspect. It seemed the investigator had hit another brick wall. Then they learned of a family connection that seemed likely to provide them with the break they so desperately needed.
It was shortly thereafter that we learned of his brother.
Jonathan Harrison was picked up for questioning.
We left the door open in the interview room, and we let his brother walk by. And his brother looked at him and said, "I told him everything, give it up, bro."
After eluding suspicion for nearly a year, both Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison confessed. According to the Harrison brothers, the weapon used on the night of the crime was an ancient Zulu warrior stick.
Yeah?
The artifact had been stolen from a local man who hunted big game in Africa. The hunter provided a full description of the club, but it was never recovered by police. On September 14, 1996, law enforcement officials arrested Donald Bradley and charged him with murder and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. That same day, investigators closed in on Linda Jones. A woman betrayed by an unfaithful spouse and her own unrestrained brutality.
Linda Jones wanted her husband back. When she finally came to the conclusion that that was never going to happen, then it became a matter of money.
Will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to have an attorney present.
And I guess in her own mind, she felt like she was not going to get the kind of money she desired from a divorce.
Investigators pieced together the events that led to Jack Jones's murder.
According to the brothers, Donald had contacted him. He said he would pay him $100 apiece to go beat this guy up. And that's what they thought they were going to do.
Donald Bradley had other plans. After calling Linda Jones several times that evening, making sure their victim was in place, the Harrison brothers burst through the front door, which Linda had left unlocked. Bradley attacked from a side entrance. Bradley grabbed the Zulu warrior stick and proceeded to bludgeon the man in a ruthless fury. Linda's wrists were taped and then cut free, and the men disappeared into the night.
Go out that way.
Later that evening, the men destroyed all evidence, burning the ski masks, their bloody clothes, and the Zulu Warrior Club. Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison pled guilty to felony third-degree murder. They were sentenced to 10 years, 6 months. A jury found Donald Bradley guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and burglary with a firearm. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Linda Jones was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a murder for hire, police must not only ID a killer, but the guilty party who concocted the crime. Life insurance, cell phone calls, and suspect behavior provide guideposts for police. But it's often the tiniest evidence that speaks the loudest, and a microscope that shows who must pay the price of murder. A friendly Midwest lodge becomes the scene of a gruesome double murder. 2 men are dead, and a safe filled with cash is missing. But the investigation runs cold until several crucial tips and equally solid lab work pry the case wide open. In Michigan, an elderly man is found brutally bludgeoned, dead in his own home. Detectives have more questions than answers as they follow a forensic trail of lies and deception, leading to an unlikely killer. Two completely separate crimes, two different killers with one common thread. Both possess a murderous rage stemming from raw greed. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Dayton, Ohio, the heart of the Midwest, where old-fashioned values are appreciated and crime still shocks the core of the community. St. Patrick's Day is usually a time of celebration, but in March of 1994, the party's aftermath took a deadly turn. Mary Pickett's husband, Frank, was unusually late. Early that morning, he'd gone back to the local lodge to clean up after the St. Patrick's Day party the night before. Mary hadn't heard from him all day, so she decided to drive to the lodge to see if he was okay. Frank's vehicle was still parked outside, and the side door of the lodge was wide open. She instinctively began to fear the worst and phoned the police. Dayton police officers responded to the scene.
My husband didn't come home last night, so I called over here and there was no answer.
Yeah, stay by the front door.
Nervously, Mary waited while the officer entered the lodge. He noticed something unsettling. The St. Patrick's Day decorations were still hanging, and it was eerily quiet. Then, on the floor of the kitchen, he discovered a lifeless body.
I'm gonna need for you to stay by the front door. Don't let anybody in.
Concerned the assailant may still be in the building, officers cautiously searched the area. The perpetrator was long gone, but before he fled, he left another calling card, a second victim. On the men's room floor, another man was dead. With not much to go on, police launched a full-scale murder investigation. Mary Pickett confirmed the identity of her husband and the other victim, maintenance worker Boyd Walker. She explained Frank and Boyd were on the cleanup committee and were getting the lodge ready for their weekly meeting. Dayton Police Detective Doyle Burke examined the bloody scene and began to piece together the events that led up to the murders.
The first thing that caught my eye was the doors were very formidably locked. However, they didn't appear to have been tampered, so I felt there was definitely no forced entry.
Detective Burke looked around for other clues and saw the cigarette machine had been pried open and nearly all the money was gone. He then found a bloody hammer on the floor of the back office.
It looks like some blood and hair on that hammer there. Do anything we want to take?
Crime scene technicians photographed the possible murder weapon. It was carefully collected and sent into the lab for analysis. Detective Burke's next move was to reconstruct the crime step by step.
The victim was in the restroom area, and he appeared to have been laid out there and then beaten to death rather than just caught by surprise. The other victim in the food preparation area was very different. He appeared to have been caught off guard before he was beaten. I kind of thought that perhaps he was the one that may have opened the door for the suspect.
Samples of the blood found in both rooms were preserved and sent to the lab along with the other evidence gathered at the scene. Detective Burke took note of the blood spatter on the walls and the floor, hoping the pattern would be a clue as to how these two men died. As coroners removed the victims' bodies from the lodge, Detective Burke had many questions about the killer. He believed the men not only knew their killer, they may have opened the door for him.
Okay, I think I'll expedite it.
The autopsies were performed at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office by Dr. Russell Updegrove.
How palpate a few skull fractures here also. We're going to need a photograph of this.
Preliminary findings indicated that Frank Pickett received 19 blows to the head. Boyd Walker had been struck 18 times. Both victims suffered cerebral contusions.
With a hard tile floor surface, and looking at the blood, it looks like he may have just been caught by surprise from behind.
Dr. Updegrove's findings also revealed the murder weapon left crescent-shaped marks on the back of their heads.
Upon further examination of the individuals at the injuries sustained on the heads of these individuals was consistent with the types of injuries that could be inflicted with a hammer.
Forensic scientist Denise Rankin processed the hammer at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab.
I examined the hammer for blood and for hair. I attempted to remove the hairs from the hammer, and there were red stains, which I tested to determine if they were blood, and I determined that they were blood, and they were a mixture of both victims' blood.
The analysis performed on the hammer came up empty. The investigation stalled. A task force meeting was called to determine the next move.
At this point, we've got nothing on it. You guys are the main crews downtown.
Detective Burke was joined by Detective Tom Lawson. Together, they headed up the task force.
We got nothing. What you guys got?
One officer learned a vagrant named Timothy Clifford had been trying to scam money from a local church on the day of the murder.
Timothy Clifford?
It was the first solid lead.
In following up on Timothy Clifford, who was an initial suspect in these offenses, the first thing we obviously did was took steps to locate him.
Detectives found Timothy Clifford at a local homeless shelter not far from the lodge. Clifford admitted he was begging at the church that day, but claimed he was in the shelter all morning.
I went to church to get some money.
He said the shelter had a book that kept track of the residents' whereabouts.
It was a lockdown facility, and during the time frame that these homicides occurred, his whereabouts were verified at that shelter.
The lead was a dead end. Detective Burke hoped the lodge manager could provide the investigation with a much-needed jump start. The manager told the detective the safe was missing. It contained all the proceeds from the party. He also said a two-wheeled dolly was missing from the back office. The manager explained to Detective Burke that Frank Pickett had an unusual habit of sealing the deposit bags with duct tape before depositing them at the bank. And since the detectives believed the men knew their killer, the lodge manager provided them with a list of employees and members, both past and present.
I had a strong belief that it was somebody familiar with the operation, and of course the first place I'm going to look is ex-employees and then current employees.
The next step was to track down anyone who might know why Frank Pickett and Boyd Walker ended up dead.
Hey, didn't you work over at Hopkins for a while?
After speaking to dozens of people, police came up empty-handed. The former workers and members all had solid alibis and had no motive for murder. But back at the station, calls and tips were pouring in. And this time, there were some promising leads. Police began to see a pattern. Most of the information revolved around one man, Edmund Emmerich. One caller said Emmerich bragged of being able to lift a safe single-handedly. And another caller said he once saw Emmerich pry open a cigarette machine at a bar. But the biggest break came when a phone tipster came into the police station.
No one tip in and of itself that was enough to say that Emmerich committed these crimes. But when the volume kept coming in with information about Emmerich and multiple tips and information about Emmerich, certainly he became an individual we were very interested in. Why don't you have a seat right here?
The informant was a local man familiar with Edmund Emmerich. He knew Emmerich had worked for a bar in the neighborhood. He said Emmerich had a reputation for beating up patrons in his own bar. Then he would call the cops and say they passed out. He said he saw Emmerich in another local hangout, getting change from the bartender when his bar ran out. He stated that Edmund Emmerich could be intimidating, a local who clearly knew his way around the bar district. He also told police Emmerich bragged that he knew where the lodge kept their safe.
There was information about Emmerich losing his job and needing money, and then shortly after these offenses, having money. So each little piece of the pie basically in and of themselves were not enough, but when they culminated, it was clear he was of high interest to us.
Police needed to find out as much information as they could about Edmund Emmerich. It didn't take long to find out he had a police record. A record which included an outstanding traffic warrant and, more interestingly, an arrest for safecracking in the state of Ohio. Once his name came up in the investigation, detectives began to keep an eye on him. The outstanding traffic warrant gave them what they needed to take him off the streets.
Stop right there, sir. Take your hands out of your pockets for me. Stand still for a minute. Let me talk to you.
The warrant gave detectives the perfect opportunity to interrogate Emmerich for a far more insidious crime, the double murder.
In the course of the investigation, we pursued several leads, but again, everything kept coming back to Emmerich.
And for the first time in this particularly violent and frustrating case, it looked as if detectives Burke and Lawson finally had a solid lead and a potential murder suspect. Dayton, Ohio detectives were making headway in the gruesome double murder that took place at a local lodge the morning after St. Patrick's Day. They had a few clues, a stolen safe, a missing dolly, and a bloody hammer. But nothing added up. After hitting several dead ends, one name repeatedly turned up on the crime tip line: Edmund Emmerich. Emmerich worked at several bars in the vicinity of the lodge and had a reputation for being hot-headed and dangerous. He had an outstanding arrest warrant, and police picked him up. Detective Doyle Burke believed they were on the right track.
There was information that was received about Emmerich being very brutal and very physical.
After his arrest, Edmund Emmerich jumped to the top of the detective suspect list when they noticed bloodstains on his clothing.
I cut myself shaving. Looks like blood to me.
He claimed he had cut himself shaving, but the detectives remained skeptical. Something didn't add up. His alibi was a little too good.
What I want to do is, for someone to tell me minute by minute, hour by hour, exactly what they had done is suspicious.
Detectives Burke and Lawson asked Emmerich to surrender his clothes as evidence.
The blood that was found on Emmerich when he was first arrested was on his shirt and on his shoes and also on his jacket.
He spent the night in jail while his clothes were sent to the lab for blood analysis. The detectives hoped the blood on Emmerich's clothes would match the victim's blood. The evidence was tested at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab. Denise Rankin explains.
There was blood on the clothing that was consistent with the suspect's own blood on his own clothes.
But like the hammer, the blood on the clothes did not bring the detectives any closer to catching the killer. In fact, the jacket appeared to support the suspect's story that he had cut himself shaving. But detectives Burke and Lawson weren't giving up on Edmund Emmerich. A warrant was issued to search his house. They discovered a deposit bag sealed with duct tape.
See what else we can come up with.
An informant had told detectives one of the murder victims sealed the bags for deposit in the same manner. Technicians photographed the evidence and took several other items of Emmerich's clothing for further forensic testing.
And you just step right down there to that gate for me.
With no immediate proof to hold Emmerich, the suspect was released. But Burke and Lawson believed they had their man. They just had to prove it. The day after his release, detectives had Emmerich's car impounded. Evidence technicians went over the automobile with a fine-tooth comb. Inside the car, they found an additional hammer and a lug wrench. Each was gathered and sent to the lab.
Get that sample and get a
Technicians took gray paint samples from smudges found inside Emmerich's car door. Investigators believed the paint might be from the lodge's missing safe. The paint smudges were analyzed at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab by Director Ken Betts.
We're looking to make the determination whether the paint, gray paint that's on the safe, was also left on the vehicle in question by the suspects.
What can I do for you?
Investigator Burke and Lawson's next move was to check on Emmerich's ever so careful alibi, starting with his family. Emmerich claimed to have spent the morning of March 19th visiting his father before heading to a local laundromat. The detectives were not surprised, nor convinced, when Emmerich's father confirmed his alibi. But a female employee at the laundromat was more helpful in punching holes in Emmerich's story. She said his behavior was suspicious on that day, that he parked unusually far away from the front door, especially since he had an incredible amount of clothes to be cleaned.
The amount of clothes that Emmerich had picked up that day was unusual, and I believe that was part of the prepared alibi, that he wanted to make it so memorable that the laundromat would remember this individual had so many clothes. It was such a big order.
But the most damning thing the laundromat worker remembered was that Emmerich left a two-wheel dolly in the parking lot of the laundromat, just like the one missing from the lodge.
And his alibi ultimately was part of his downfall, in that it leads us to being able to verify that a two-wheel dolly is taken from the scene of the crime, and Emmerich's in possession of a two-wheel dolly just moments after the crimes have occurred.
Then a phone call came into the Dayton Police Department. It was the break the detectives had been waiting for. A discarded safe found right in the area where Emmerich had based his whole alibi. A safe so heavy, even a strong man like Emmerich would need a dolly to transport it. Police examined the abandoned safe found outside a hardware store. The front door had been completely pried off. The local hardware store clerk said she had seen a white male matching Emmerich's description, wheeling the safe down the street on a two-wheel dolly. It was as if the dam had burst open on the case. And the safe and the dolly were just the beginning. Test results came back from the forensics lab. There was blood on one of Emmerich's shirts, and it matched the blood of one of the murder victims.
The blood on the shirt was from the scene, and we were able to tie him to that scene with that blood.
Evidence was mounting, and detectives were closing in on Edmund Emmerich. But it would take one more piece of damning forensic evidence and an eyewitness to bring this killer to justice. Local bartender Edmund Emmerich was the strongest suspect detectives Burke and Lawson had in their investigation of a brutal double murder and robbery at a local lodge in downtown Dayton, Ohio. Emmerich had a reputation for violence and a criminal conviction for safecracking. A combination of circumstantial and definitive evidence was mounting a case against the suspect. But it was a paint smudge found inside Emmerich's car that provided a crucial piece of physical evidence. At the State Crime Lab, Director Ken Betts compared the paint smudge found in the car to paint scraped from an abandoned safe.
We were able to determine that the paint found on the vehicle was consistent with the gray paint of the safe. And it became another investigative tool for Dayton Police detectives to go forward with.
After chasing down leads for weeks, Detectives Burke and Lawson were finalizing their case against Edmund Emmerich. But there was one more piece of evidence. An eyewitness came forward. His name was Brian Towns, a local homeless man who actually saw Emmerich enter the lodge on the morning of the killings.
In interviewing him, we were able to determine that he not only saw Emmerich down at the scene of the crime that day, he saw the door that he entered in. He also saw him exit, and also even spoke with Emmerich during the time frame that we were certain these homicides had occurred. Eddie went into Hoppy's.
When Emmerich came out of the bar, Towns bummed $20 from him and watched him go on his way. Detective Burke showed Towns some photos, and the homeless man positively ID'd Emmerich.
You saw at Hoppy's that day?
Yeah.
That's Eddie. Off hours with only two people there, you're not going to let a stranger in. And we come to find out that Emmerich did know both individuals. Emmerich, of course, through Brian Towns, was identified as being at the scene.
Detectives now had a man placing Emmerich at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders. But they were taking no chances before arresting Emmerich again. Back at the crime lab, another piece of forensic evidence proved Edmund Emmerich was the killer. Toolmark examiner Tim Dewar cast impressions from the lug wrench found in Emmerich's car.
Identifying a tool mark to a specific tool is like identifying a latent fingerprint at a crime scene to a known fingerprint of a suspect.
The impressions from the lug wrench were then compared to molds of impressions found on both the cigarette machine and the safe from the lodge. They were a perfect match.
The castings from the cigarette machine were microscopically compared to the castings of the test tool marks from the tire iron. Upon comparison, several matches were found between the two, and with that, the conclusion can be drawn that the tire tool made the tool marks on the cigarette machine, to the exclusion of all other tools.
The tool impression match was the final piece of the evidence puzzle. Not only did police have an eyewitness placing Emmerich at the scene, they now had clear evidence. He had broken into the cigarette machine and safe. Police went in to make an arrest. Although Emmerich tried to run, the police completely surrounded the house. There was nowhere for Emmerich to hide. After weeks of tracking down the killer, detectives got their man. And they were now about to get the full story of what happened at the lodge that tragic morning. As suspected, Boyd Walker knew his killer and naively opened the door to his own murderer. He had no way of knowing that Emmerich had come into the bar intent on murder and robbery. When Walker turned his back, Emmerich grabbed a hammer and brutally killed him. Just as viciously as he had struck Boyd Walker, Emmerich killed Frank Pickett. In just a matter of minutes, both men were dead. Emmerich scrambled, grabbed the dolly, and wheeled the safe out of the lodge. He later abandoned the dolly in the laundromat parking lot.
Emmerich was in dire need of money, and this was an opportunity to take advantage of two individuals that would trust him.
Edmund Emmerich was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder for his fatal assault on the 2 bar workers, as well as a count of robbery. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Some killers prey on unsuspecting targets of opportunity, making it easier for them to conceal their identity.
I'll have to ask Frank if we got it.
Others strike closer to home, leaving behind traces of raw greed. Emmett Township is a rapidly growing community of 12,000 people located on the eastern border of Battle Creek, Michigan. They pride themselves on being a close-knit, safe haven. Which is why what happened on the morning of April 26, 1996, was such a shock to the small town. That morning, Sharon Zachary went to check on Bob Rogers. She had been taking care of the 81-year-old man and rented a house down the street from him. Sharon was worried. She hadn't heard from Bob all morning. When Sharon saw his car at the side of his house, she became particularly concerned. He never parked there, and he hadn't been answering his phone. Her concerns were instantly confirmed when she saw the sliding side door to the house had been completely smashed in. She ran for help. Sharon Zachary was panicked. Her friend Bob had been the victim of several robberies in recent months. It looked as if this was another one.
Attention all Emmett officers. Be advised, 7419 Jefferson Drive, our check welfare, possible assault.
Officers were familiar with Bob Rogers. It was not the first time they had been summoned to his residence. They knew the elderly man had a reputation for being a pack rat and for keeping large amounts of cash around the house. They entered the home carefully and cautiously so they would not disturb any potential evidence. But this time, the crime was worse. There, lying face up in his family room, was Bob Rogers. And he was dead.
Hello? Is Bob okay?
No, he's not, man.
We have signal 15 here. I'm going to need nav tech, also notify command, please.
Emmett police now had what appeared to be a homicide on their hands. Lieutenant Thomas Headley arrived, prepared to begin the investigation. His first move was to speak with Sharon Zachary, the woman who had discovered the body.
The house here, Mr. Rogers' house. The other officer arrived.
After asking her to go to the station to make a statement, he examined the bloody crime scene. From the start, Lieutenant Headley knew this crime did not happen like the others.
This crime scene is a little bit odd to me. It's not consistent with what we know of the behavior of Mr. Rogers. Also, the fact that the sliding glass door was broken in the rear of the house was not consistent with the other crime scenes. People did not have to go through that effort to gain insurance.
Among the strewn clothing and blood spatter, the crime tech team took measurements, photos, and samples, all potential evidence. Forensic technicians paid particularly close attention to the victim's twisted belt buckle.
Pick it up, we'll get one more.
Glass shards were photographed and collected for possible hand or footprints.
I got more money up here.
Not surprising to Lieutenant Headley was the large amounts of cash found stashed in various places around the room.
He was an elderly male, probably lived during the Depression, carried the money on him probably as a feeling of security.
Headley knew one thing. He was certain money was the motive. Now he had to find out who was responsible. At the Emmett police station, Lieutenant Anthony Geigel questioned Sharon Zachary. She told Lieutenant Geigel about her relationship with Bob Rogers.
You know, because every once in a while he'd
She said she befriended the old man and rented one of his many properties. Zachary explained she was concerned about Mr. Rogers' safety, and she even insisted that he move in with her. She said she was tired of standing idly by, while the old man repeatedly was the victim of violent robberies.
Went to the door.
Zachary told the lieutenant she saw no one the morning she found Bob Rogers' body. She went to his home when she hadn't heard from him. But to Geigel, there was something a little off about Sharon Zachary's story, and something odd about the whole murder.
The crime scene didn't match what had normally occurred in the past. The scene just had an aura about it that just something didn't seem right. It almost appeared that somebody tried really hard to make this look like a robbery.
Bob Rogers' autopsy was performed at the Sparrow Hospital morgue. Dr. Joyce DeYoung fingerprinted the victim post-mortem. She needed to determine which prints found on the scene belonged to the victim and which belonged to the possible killer or killers. DeYoung noted severe blunt trauma to Rogers' head and body.
Mr. Rogers had between 25 and 30 blows to the head. Most of the injuries to the head were of the back and on the left side of the head, which certainly would suggest that the blows were being inflicted from somebody from behind.
Judging from the position of Rogers' body and its decomposition, Dr. DeYoung concluded that Rogers' body was most likely moved after his fatal beating. She called Lieutenant Geigel to report her conclusions.
There is a pool of blood near the body that appeared to be where the body was in a face-down position, and then the body is rolled, and the hands and the forearms are up in the air after rigor mortis had set.
With fingerprints from the victim, forensic scientists began piecing together Bob Rogers' murder. Using a technique specifically designed for lifting fingerprints from porous surfaces, they analyzed the victim's belt. Numerous prints were lifted from the belt. Most of them belonged to Rogers, but one did not.
In fact, if it was someone other than the victim's print on their pants, then obviously it was somebody that touched that area. It would not likely have remained on the surface of the belt while the victim was wearing it in a conventional manner.
Scientists also found some compelling evidence on one of the shards from the broken sliding glass door. It was a muddy tennis shoe imprint.
Simply by walking over glass, the design elements of the shoe are reproduced on that glass with incredible detail. Including the not only the design, but wear characteristics, size, the individual characteristics, unique features about a shoe that enable us to positively identify the shoe.
The evidence was compelling, but it seemed to be leading nowhere. Lieutenant Geigel had no suspects, and every day that passed was another day the killer was free. Emmett Township Police were investigating the death of Bob Rogers, an elderly man who had been the victim of repeated robberies. They had evidence, fingerprints, and a muddy shoe print. Lieutenant Headley readied the next plan of attack. He knew the strong evidence in the case would ultimately help him convict the right suspect. Emmett Police organized a task force to brainstorm leads in the brutal murder. And they made a shocking discovery.
Apparently, Mr.
They learned Sharon Zachary had power of attorney over Bob Rogers' finances.
Yes, I did. I contacted the county.
Since she was the one who found his body and had unlimited access to his house, they needed to eliminate her as a suspect.
Still valid.
They obtained a search warrant and began to look into her affairs.
We started talking to family members, and as a result, we started looking at her a little closer as a possible suspect.
Their first stop was to return to the crime scene. Thousands of dollars were found in the house, cash stashed in every room. Investigators removed files and records from Rogers' home. In poring over his records, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley learned Sharon Zachary was using Rogers' credit cards.
Same thing here as some charge
Detectives
cards.
began to suspect their hunch about Sharon Zachary had been right.
We also pulled bank account statements, discovered that she had been actually withdrawing some funds from some of his bank account. So that kind of led us into motive a little bit, that there might be more to this and that there might be some money that may be at issue.
I handle all of his legal and financial matters. As a matter of fact, he was in here.
For further insight into Rogers' finances, they decided to question his lawyer.
Power of attorney to a Sharon Zachary.
Rogers' lawyer explained Zachary was granted power of attorney 4 months before the murder. But just 2 weeks before being found dead, the elderly man had abruptly changed his mind. He discovered $10,000 missing from one of his accounts, and he was furious.
The case further developed when we learned that Mr. Rogers had made a will leaving the property that belongs to him to Sharon Zachary upon his death.
With a motive clearly in place, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley sent an investigator to Rogers' bank. The bank manager said Sharon Zachary came in with Bob Rogers about a year before his death, asking to be put on his account. Rogers sat by uncomfortably while the paperwork was completed. But he returned alone the next day, requesting she be removed from the account.
He wanted her removed as the power of attorney. He wanted to handle his own affairs as he didn't trust Sharon Zachary any longer.
Mr. Rogers hadn't been able to get to his will yet. He was unfortunately murdered before he was able to do that.
Finally, detectives spoke to a security guard at a local discount store. Zachary went to buy some shoes and attempted to use Bob Rogers' credit card. When the card was declined, security was summoned to the counter. They called Rogers at his house, and he told them that under no circumstances did he give Zachary permission to use his credit card. She insisted there was a mix-up.
The significance of this card was that it caused Mr. Rogers to become suspicious, because at that time he would have felt that he was being cheated by Sharon Zachary.
It was a huge break in the case. Detectives Geigel and Headley had confirmation that Sharon Zachary was desperately trying to take advantage of 81-year-old Bob Rogers. They were becoming more and more convinced that it was Zachary who killed the elderly man in a fit of greed. But they needed proof. If they could find a way to directly prove her guilt, the detectives knew they had found their murderer.
Take a look at what you got.
Lieutenant Geigel and Lieutenant Headley were hot on the trail of the murderer of 81-year-old Bob Rogers.
Okay, what do you got?
The man was bludgeoned to death in his own home, and preliminary evidence was pointing to the guilt of his caretaker, Sharon Zachary.
Looks like she may have signed his name.
Zachary had been taking advantage of her power of attorney over Rogers' finances. It seemed clear the old man didn't appreciate Zachary spending his money.
We were trying to find anything that would link Zachary into any kind of financial wrongdoing. Anything that we could find to help try to kind of piece everything together. Plus, we still had not found a murder weapon.
Then, another discovery. Lieutenant Headley learned Zachary had tried to get the plans to Rogers' land. They studied Bob Rogers' land plot. They wondered why Sharon Zachary, who rented one of Rogers' homes, would request a copy of Rogers' property plan. What they noticed immediately was the amount of water on Rogers' property. They knew one of the ponds would be the perfect place to stash a murder weapon.
There were 3 ponds that were adjacent to the house of Mr. Rogers, and we thought that possibly that they were used to hide the murder weapon. It is also interesting that there's a worn-down trail that leads from this area of the 3rd pond behind Mr. Rogers' house to the house where Sharon Zachary lived.
divers were dispatched to check the pond. And the detective's instinct paid off. The divers pulled a 3-foot section of pipe from the water. At the crime lab, forensic scientists examined the pipe. Although a long shot, there could still be blood evidence on the pipe. Forensic scientist Marjorie Harris.
You have pores and crevices and cracks that allow the blood actually to soak into the weapon itself, or dents. If you have cracks and crevices in a metal object, you still have pockets where the blood can accumulate and actually dry and adhere to those surfaces.
Despite the fact the pipe had been submerged in the pond, it still had remains of human blood.
I was very glad that we found it. I don't believe this has ever happened before, that a murder weapon like this could be retrieved being submerged in water and still have viable DNA that could be identified.
Forensic investigators replicated the blood spatter of the crime scene. Using a pipe similar to the one found in the pond, they struck a melon to simulate a skull. Comparing crime scene photos to the crime reconstruction, forensic investigators concluded the pipe pulled from the pond was the same pipe used to kill Bob Rogers.
We like to do a crime scene reconstruction where we can tell a series or a sequence of events. What happened, where did it happen, what was the order that it happened.
The detectives felt they finally had all the ammunition they needed to go after Sharon Zachary. With a search warrant in hand, they entered her house.
By seizing the financial records in Sharon Zachary's house, it shows that she had an interest in the finances of Mr. Rogers, and that she wanted to know, apparently, more about what kind of money that he had available to him.
Sharon Zachary was cooperative in allowing police to remove Bob Rogers' records from her house. The officers asked her for a pair of tennis shoes for comparison to a shoe print found at the crime scene. Without any argument, she produced a pair of white tennis shoes, which they promptly bagged for testing. Back at the crime lab, treads on Sharon Zachary's tennis shoes were compared with the footprints found on the broken glass at the murder scene. Although she insisted she never went in the house that morning, the preserved prints matched those of Sharon Zachary's perfectly.
The individual characteristics are exactly the same. Therefore, the impression from your crime scene and the impression made by the known shoe from the suspect are one and the same.
The shoe print was enough to arrest Sharon Zachary. It definitively placed her at the scene of the crime. The woman who claimed to be Bob Rogers' caregiver was now being arrested for his murder.
We believe that the forensic evidence that we located clearly established that she was at the crime scene. We established that Sharon Zachary was untruthful, and we believe that Sharon Zachary murdered Mr. Rogers.
Back at the crime lab, forensic scientists were comparing a fingerprint found on Bob Rogers' belt with Zachary's prints. It was a perfect match.
We actually physically found Zachary's print on the back of Mr. Rogers' belt, which shows that she had contact with the body. That didn't match with what she initially had told our officers.
Zachary said it was only natural they had evidence linking her to the crime scene. She said she spent so much time taking care of the old man that it was not surprising her print would be on his belt. But forensics told a different story about the print.
It is very fragile in nature and in all likelihood would have been destroyed in simply placing the belt through the belt loops and attaching it to the pants. If it has been on a person's clothing for a period of time, it's not likely that either the victim's print or a suspect print would be present on the underside of that belt.
It was too late for Sharon Zachary. The evidence against her was overwhelming.
I don't believe you. I gave you a
and everything was pointing to her guilt.
The forensic evidence that we gathered at the scene of this incident were key into solving this crime. Everything from the thumbprint to the shoe impressions that were pulled to the murder weapon that we eventually found submerged in one of the ponds. That pulled everything together, made all the pieces fit, and allowed us to solve this homicide.
Sharon Zachary could no longer hide from what detectives were able to piece together. Angered by not being able to freely spend Roger's money, Sharon Zachary let greed get the better of her.
Keep looking, keep looking.
On the morning of April 26th, she went over to his house. While he was stashing away some of his cash, she struck the elderly man repeatedly with a pipe.
I think she finally saw an opportunity to take him out of the picture, collect all of his estate, and walk away scot-free.
She rifled through Roger's pockets, turning them inside out and removing the cash.
My guess is that she knew exactly what she was going to do when she went over there. She knew, based on his history of the robberies and the prior assaults on Mr. Rogers, that she was going to make it look exactly like that.
Attempting to make the premeditated killing look like a random robbery, she then went outside and smashed the sliding glass door.
Mr. Robert Rogers. Officer, would you take...
And after she did it, she tried to make the place look like your typical textbook breaking and entering. But she forgot a couple key facts. And I think that was her ultimate downfall.
Lieutenants Headley and Geigel's strong detective work held up in court. Sharon Zachary was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Some are victims of circumstance, killed for being at the wrong place at the absolute wrong time. Others are exactly where they belong, but remain unsafe from killers who seek them out with a motive of raw greed.